I'm really, really excited that Jamil not only agreed to be a speaker, but agreed to open the conference. I think he's just a perfect speaker to do this. Jamil grew up in a mostly immigrant community in Toronto, where he was nearly lost to feelings of hopelessness, anger, and hate. At 16 years of age, he was labeled illiterate by the public school system, but Jamil turned his life around with support of role models and mentors. He went on to graduate from Yale Law School, teach at Osgoode Hall Law School, dedicated his career to supporting youth facing the challenges that he did. His work has taken him all over the world, from Belgium to Egypt, where he studied ways to help young men escape the influence of terrorist groups, to Ohio, where he partnered with JD Vance, author of Hillbilly Elegy, to help solve America's opioid crisis. So some obviously very, very serious issues. Jamil's leadership has been recognized with awards from many organizations, the International Development and Relief Foundation, Yale University, York University, and most recently, at 31 years of age, Jamil survived a fight with stage 4 cancer, which gave him even greater insights into how people can overcome adversity. His first book was Why Young Men? The Dangerous Allure of Violent Movements, and What We Can Do About It, and it was published just this year. We're really, really honored to have Jamil open up the conference. Please.
Everybody. Thank you. All right, can you hear me okay at the back? Awesome. Okay. Thanks for your patience. So yeah, my name is Jamil Jivani. Very nice to be here with you. Like probably many of you, cafe first came onto my radar during controversy, and I think like many people, that gave me, I think, a pretty skewed understanding of the organization. So getting to know Justin and getting to know Robert has actually helped me understand, I think, the really important work that Cafe does and the impact they're trying to have on the lives of boys and young men in Canada, and hopefully, in partnership across the world. So I'm really, happy to be here and happy to deliver the first presentation of the conference and to be with you all this morning. I'm going to focus on sort of the connection between sort of race and gender in my presentation, partly because that is sort of what my life has been in some ways, but also because I think it touches on some important strategic and practical considerations that people who want to be helpful to boys and young men in our society. When I say our society, frankly, I think across North America and also in Europe, a lot of what I will talk about is quite applicable. So normally when I do these talks, I sort of, when people introduce you, they start with all of the accomplishments you've had or reasons why people might take you seriously or consider you to be a credible speaker on the subject. But I always like to sort of start with some of the probably down periods of my life, because I think it will give you some insight into who I am. And also, this is something that I do with my book and a lot of my work. I try to be as personal where I think it's helpful, just to illustrate sort of the sort of boys and young men we're talking about, right? I think I'm like a pretty good example of one of the boys who we are, I hope, all animated to be helpful to. And I'm going to start sort of with that part of my story. So here is a picture of me when I was in grade 10. I'm 15 years old. I had obviously a lot more hair back then. Also, I'm wearing what I think is the most dated clothing brand from my generation. In this picture, this is basically just a couple months before I would write the Ontario literacy test, which for those of you who are from Ontario, that's our provincial exam. Other jurisdictions have equivalents of it. But the general idea is that you write this test, everyone in your grade does, and it's supposed to measure whether you are literate at your grade level or close to your grade level. And so I write this test, I'm 15 years old, and then I fail it, right? And so I am labeled illiterate, I have a very awkward conversation with my teacher, and I go home feeling like, a little bit like ticked off about it, but honestly didn't care so much about school, so I didn't take it very seriously. A year after this picture is taken, as a grade 11 student, I have to go back to school again to rewrite this test. And in Ontario, we do this thing that I think is quite foolish, which is that we make only grade 10 students are supposed to go back to school on the day that this exam is given. So when you're a grade 11 student and you go to school that day, everyone knows you failed it the year before, right? And that is, yeah, I mean, like, you know, private failure, right, is one thing, but public failure is a whole different kind of humiliation, I think. And for me, even as someone who didn't care so much about school, that really bothered me, that I was sort of outing myself as what I thought was a stupid person, right? And so this is sort of this moment that I try to kind of anchor a lot of my sort of remarks in, because obviously, like, I mean, I was certainly capable of a lot more than what the public school system was able to recognize at that point. Like, a year after graduating from high school, I had the President's Medal at Humber College. 4 years after that, I finished at York University with a scholarship to Yale University. I mean, my life moved very quickly after high school, right? And I think I've proven quite clearly that I was poorly understood by the public school system and poorly served by it. But it's, yeah, thank you. But I do think it's worth sort of trying to understand, well, how does someone, right, with that sort of potential get buried to the point where it's that unrecognizable, not just to my teachers, my mother, but also to myself. And so let me paint that picture a little bit, right? So I'm growing up without a father, which I presume most people in this room, I hope, would recognize the sort of deep wounds that often inflicts on children, but I think unique wounds that it inflicts on boys. I saw outside in the hallway Warren Farrell's Boy Crisis on one of those tables, and he does an excellent job, I think, of outlining some of the psychological, cultural, social, emotional impacts that growing up without a dad has on boys. And I was very much one of those boys. I read about the psychology of a child born without a father around, and I kind of think of myself as almost this sort of perfect case study of a lot of what I read. I was going to school every day, sort of searching for some sort of masculine role model in my life. I was going to a school that didn't really offer those, right, and in multiple capacities. I was in a neighborhood that lacked a lot of community institutions. I grew up about half an hour outside of here in a place called Brampton, which perhaps some of you will be familiar with. And at the time, we were the first group of families to live in that area. It was a brand new area, newly urbanized. There were no community services, there were no churches, there was one Gurdwara there, but aside from that, and that Gurdwara took on a lot of weight for the community, but I'm not a Sikh person, I'm not an Indian person, and so that didn't really have a cultural role in my life. And so we were a bunch of boys, and many of us didn't have dads around, who also didn't have much of a community around us. And our mothers were trying really hard, I think, to provide for us. And I had that, wonderful FUBU shirt, so my mother clearly was providing to some degree. But, in terms of sort of emotional support, psychological support, cultural support, and guidance, I was lacking. And so I gravitated to the sort of low-hanging fruit that was available to me as a boy, which is pop culture, right? And so I listened to a lot of music, I used to watch a lot of TV, and the men that I saw most like me at that point in my life were rappers. And this is true for my peer group too. We mimicked everything we saw on TV. We tried our absolute best to be like DMX and like Tupac, like Allen Iverson, our favorite basketball player. And we took mostly the negative attributes that they brought with them, right? So the anger, the frustration, the emotional recklessness, the desire to seek out conflict, to be physically aggressive. Those are the things that we learned from those men and didn't really have any counterexamples in our lives to sort of balance that out. So when I was going to school every day, I'm going to start fights in the cafeteria. I'm going to wave a bandana in someone's face. I'm not going to school to do homework and learn how to read. And that was, I think, the mentality I was carrying with me into school, was a mentality of, sort of believing in sort of, I would say, maybe a failed meritocracy, right? That the frustrations I carried in my household were not recognized by the school that I went to every day. The teachers who purported to be people who were trying to help me had no ability to talk about the things that were most important to me. I mean, you're sitting there and you're being asked to read a novel that was written 50 years ago. Meanwhile, the thing you're actually upset about is that you don't have a dad at home and your mom's melting down every morning, and no one knows how to talk to you about that. So it's hard then to think that school is a place that's supposed to help you. And that's the mentality I came in with. So when I'm in grade 10 and I'm writing this test that's supposed to measure whether I can read and write well, I'm sort of looking at it and like, I just don't care, right? Now my mother fought with me after that and made me retake the test and not drop out of school, God bless her. So I did thankfully pass it the year later. But you know, here's a picture of me at 18 turning 19. And I look at this young man and I say like, he was a very lucky guy, right? Because in the years prior, right, between when I'm pictured at 15 and I'm failing literacy tests to when I'm 18 and 19, I come incredibly close to making mistakes that might have had an irreversible impact on my life, right? In grade 11, I come very close to buying a gun. My best friends are in and out of jail. I just sort of give up on having a job because I thought I was never going to make money from school or working. I had a really good friend who was a follower of Louis Farrakhan in the Nation of Islam, which is a rather hateful sort of group, a very sort of anti-social way of looking at the world that breeds conflict between people. And I used to go to that in those Nation of Islam meetings. I traveled to Detroit to hear Louis Farrakhan speak. And I look at that boy and I say, well, he's growing into a man, but there's a lot of mistakes he could have made in response to those feelings he had when he was 15. I was very close to being the kind of young man you might read about in the news. Like we had a recent shoot. I mean, Toronto, like most cities in North America, there are increases in crime every summer. And if you pay attention every day, you can be reminded of what happens when boys struggle in the school system and don't have good role models around them and don't have community resources. They wind up dead and they wind up killing each other. And that's what happens in this city every day. And every time I read one of those news stories, like I did last night when a young man was killed in the Falstaff area of Toronto, I think, I could have been that really easily, right? So now I'm giving you like a pretty concise overview, I think, of some of the challenges I experienced as a teenager. But the reason I wanted to do this was one, to show you sort of, I guess, where my perspective comes from, but also to show you that, in the life of this boy who is now this man, there's like so many different angles that you could take if you were trying to assess my life. So for example, one of the ways that a lot of people would interpret the story I just told you is that it is a story of race and not a story of gender, right? That they would hear me and say, well, you can tell by how I look, I am not a white person, right? My mother is white, she is an Irish, Scottish, Canadian, but my father is an immigrant to this country from Kenya. I grew up in a mostly immigrant community where most people were either Jamaican or they were Indian. And the failings of the school system are partly because they were completely unresponsive to the unique social circumstances of my community. Also, some of the feelings of anger and frustration I had, or perhaps the reason why rappers were people I identified with, is because I was looking for people who looked like me, and I thought that was really important. Now, you might hear that and say, and I feel this to this day, that that shouldn't be where you go for role models. But if you imagine a bunch of kids who get followed around at the mall because their skin is a bit darker, or the cops follow them home on the way from the bus, it's hard to not see race as a sort of key part of your identity, right? And so even if we say in an ideal world, this young boy is growing up in a world where Bill Clinton is president of the United States. He didn't have a father. He grew up in poverty, far worse than any material circumstances I had. I could have looked at Bill Clinton and said, well, that's an example of someone who is able to overcome great adversity. And maybe that's the reason I should try a little bit harder in school, because things could work out for me like they did for him. But I didn't see myself in Bill Clinton because I was getting followed home by cops. And I thought, well, they wouldn't do that to Bill Clinton. And that was the part of my identity that I was holding on to very deeply. It became sort of a rite of passage, I thought, as a black man, to be criminalized, right? And when that is happening to you, you start to think of it, okay, well then I'm growing up, I'm a man, right? I'm a grown-up man. Are following me, and teachers are suspending me, and I'm being treated unfairly. And you equate maturity with unfairness. So that is sort of the dimensions, I think, of growing up. Because I'm also, if you take race out of it and you just hear a story about a fatherless kid who grew up in a neighborhood with a mom who tried her best, but wound up sort of failing out of the school system, that happens to a lot of boys. Boys of all colors, right? Boys of all economic backgrounds. So in my own story, I think it shows that depending on what you want to read into, you can make race more or less relevant, you can make my gender more or less relevant, and that is sort of the power, I think, that we have when we interpret narratives and when we hear people, and in the work that we do, when we meet people, and we hear their story, we hear what they go through, we have the option of figuring, well, what am I going to do with that? How do I filter that? How do I bring meaning to what people are going through in the world? Now, well, thankfully or not, I suppose it's up to your interpretation, I have strong views on this stuff, unsurprisingly. And that's sort of what I want to talk about right now, which is, what do you do with a boy like me, right? And there is a pressure, I feel now as a person in the public square, to what I would describe as submit my vision for what I would like for boys and young men to race politics, right? And what I mean by that is to say that, well, don't worry about me as a man, worry about me as a black man. And that if we're going to look at the boys who experienced things I did, you should isolate my experience based on my race and think of me as being very different from boys who look different than I do. I think that is a growing trend, not just in our society today for many reasons, but it's always been a problem. It's how we looked at boys who were being, given different legal status than other boys and decided that was acceptable, right? It's how we were okay with different sentencing being used to punish some boys over other boys, right? I mean, this has been a function of our society for as long as we've been trying to be better people. And it's still a pervasive problem, and it happens in ways that I think we are afraid to challenge because we have been led to believe that now putting race first is some sort of, for some groups, is some sort of exercise in equality. And I think that's what I hope that I can challenge with the remainder of my presentation today. So when I say challenge, I'm describing what I think it looks like to say, I want to help young men without making race politics my agenda, right? That you might hear a story like mine, and even though I might not look like what your son or your cousin or your brother might look like, that you would feel like I could be your son or your cousin or your brother. And that's what I want to explore. So first I want to just sort of maybe point out in some specific problems what that looks like. So here you have, I don't know how clear it is, the text for you, but I'll kind of explain it. These are two graphs. On the left, on your left is a visual of what education attainment looks like in the United States today. And what you will see on your left is most of the people in that first dark greenish blue bar, most of those people are men, right? So most of the people who are not completing high school are men. If you disaggregate that by race, which is what this visual is intended to do, you will see that based on your race, that looks very different, okay? So for instance, the number of black men who are not completing high school in the United States is almost double the number of white men. When you factor in language, which is what the Hispanic measurement does, which isn't really a good measure of race at all, because people of various races may identify as Hispanic, you also see that number is double what the black number is, right? But you also see that in other groups, you have meaningful variation. Now, you might look at this and say, well, this is an example of why when I tell my story about failing high school, people say, well, look, he's one of those examples of that 20% of black students who are not finishing high school, right? That's how they hear me, okay? And what I'm sort of, I guess, trying to push back on is not that that's irrelevant. I'm not saying we shouldn't have data like this. In fact, I think it's important because then maybe when you look in your city and you see that there's like meaningful racial segregation where people live, and you're deciding, well, where should we put our services for boys who are struggling academically, and you're not in a neighborhood where a lot of black people live, you might not be reaching the boys that you are hoping to, right? So it's a relevant data point for how you might deploy your services in a city. But the question then becomes, well, does that mean that the way to solve this problem is that we should have a momentum for black boys, and a momentum for white boys, and a momentum for Hispanic boys, right? And I'm saying, no, I don't think that's the case. If you look at this graph here, which is from Toronto, it's from the Toronto District School Board, and it shows that in a city where black people are about 1 out of 10 Toronto residents, black people, vast majority are male, make up almost 1/3 of school suspensions, right? Again, I was one of those kids who gets suspended from school. You can look at this data, you can hear my story, you can say, well, that's what he's an example of, right? But there's also a whole bunch of other people getting suspended. And is it helpful to make my story an isolated example of what one boy from one racial group would go through, or the things you might learn about our broader society from my experience, right? Of what it might feel like if you were an East Asian boy who failed the literacy test to go to school and be outed as what you think is stupid, right? So this is sort of what I'm trying to get at here, which is that I am not a person who believes that bringing up race in a conversation is unhelpful, but rather it's a matter of what you do with it, right? And here would be another great example of that, right? Here's the incarceration problem we have. I'm a person who came very close to being arrested and being caught for crimes that could have led me incarcerated for many, many years. So when I see statistics like this, I see behind these numbers, behind these bars, lost potential, right? This is one of the kind of issues in our societies that bother me the most, quite honestly, because we have built a judicial system that when people enter incarceration, they are almost invariably worse off than when they went. So you look at this, on the left is the United States, okay? So in the United States, you've got some numbers here that show some disproportionality in what the incarcerated population looks like. The black incarcerated number is almost triple its overall number in the US population. With white people, it's actually fewer representation. With Hispanic, it's also higher, right? And so you look at this and you say, well, are we uniquely concerned that there are lots of people, mostly men, being taken from their families for things like, weed possession, and their lives are being ruined and they're having a hard time re-entering the job market? Like, is that the tragedy? Or is it especially tragic because more of those men are black? And so if I tell my story, do you hear it as a potential story of lost potential of a man who could have been a father and could have contributed to a neighborhood and could have contributed to his community? Or do you hear it as a story about race, right? And in America, that's actually what's sort of happening at the moment, right? Is that for many, many decades, the United States has been locking up more people than any other country in the world, and has never really had a meaningful political response to it, both on the front end with whether you should be locking these men up to begin with, but also on the back end with what are you doing with those men when they leave. And it's only been recently that this sort of has become a mainstream political issue in the United States, and the shape that it's taken is in the form of what we would call racial justice, right? So if you look at the Democratic primary debates that are happening right now, or happened earlier this week, or you look at the first debate that happened a month ago in Miami, what you see in those debates are people who are bringing this issue up in the context of race, right? They're talking about it as, this is a race problem in America, this is an issue with racial disproportionality. The conversation, though, is not really about, well, what is the consequence that has for people, right? These are boys, these are sons, these are brothers, these are fathers. And I think that is actually where you get sort of the bigger understanding of what is the kind of interconnectedness of this problem. Because for every man that makes up those numbers, there are children, there are women, there are families. I mean, this is a much bigger issue when you actually see this as relational and not a race-based problem. In Canada, which is the graph on the right-hand side, what you actually see, and this is something we don't talk very much about, is that between both countries, the greatest disproportionality of all is with Aboriginal prisoners in Canada. So in Canada, we tend to sort of see ourselves as having a less concerning incarceration issue because our overall numbers are not as bad. But if you're an Aboriginal kid growing up in some parts of this country, you know a lot of people who've been to prison. I mean, that's the reality. And you have a lot of people in your social network who have been imprisoned at some point or convicted of a crime. And you wonder, well, what does that do to a boy when you, from a very young age, see going to prison as something that might be normal, right? And that's sort of the concern that I think is worth sort of gleaning from this, to me, is, well, based on where you live in this country, going to prison is going to seem a lot more normal than it might be in other parts of this country. And if you want to help boys, that's something that's worth knowing, right? So, if you go next, so I want to talk about what I mean when I say submitting to race politics, okay? Because I think that there's some nuance to this that I hope I do a good job of trying to illustrate. So when I say submitting to race politics, I think of this as, are we organizing ourselves with race as being at the forefront of our identities, right? Meaning, if I want to have a conversation with you about how to help boys, you don't hear me if I'm talking about boys of one racial group versus another, right? Or you're less animated to want to help if I'm talking about boys of one racial group over another. Another way to flip it would be that when I'm trying to solve these problems, I'm trying to solve them in a balkanized way, right? So as the example I gave, if we want to improve education outcomes, or we want to help fathers who might be leaving the prison system reintegrate with their families, is the challenge to do that for them as men, or is the challenge to do that for them as black men, or Aboriginal men, or Hispanic men, or white men? And I think this is a really important question to ask, because it gets to who do we feel responsible for helping in our society? And it also gets to what is the way in which you want to communicate about these issues. So the examples I have here, right? So for example, Black Lives Matter. And I actually chose a picture for this, which shows the people holding this Black Lives Matter are not all black people, right? And I just want to highlight that because black is invoked in the Black Lives Matter name, it is perceived as a movement that is sort of racialized for one group of people. The reality is that it's actually a very expansive movement that involves a lot of different people, and is no more, I would say, authentic of a political representation of black Americans as it is any other group, right? So the point I'm making here is, if our concern is about boys and men being victims of police brutality, is the goal to address this on a racial front as a problem, or is the goal to define this in a more expansive way? And what is actually more helpful for the ultimate purpose of trying to make people's lives better? That's a question I think is really worth asking ourselves. Here's an example of where you have someone like Bernie Sanders, right, in the United States Senate, presidential candidate. Most of you are probably familiar with him. He operated on what I would call a certain sort of colorblind class politics in much of his career. And even when he first started running for president, that was a big part of his sort of value proposition, is that he was bringing something different to a democratic status quo that was very focused on race and identity, and he was trying to unite people based on class. And gradually, he sort of surrendered, right? I mean, he got criticized for it. His speeches were stormed by protesters who wanted him to talk about race, and eventually have him with one of the people I regard as like a pretty well-established charlatan in Al Sharpton, right? And now you have this sort of, what I think are very corrosive race politics that Al Sharpton represents. Someone who goes out of his way to invoke race as frequently as possible because it continually gives him a platform and credibility and a way to make his voice matter relative to anyone else who might be speaking. And you have Bernie Sanders now standing beside this man and side hugging him, right? And to me, that's sort of a symbol of what sort of submitting to race politics looks like, is that you start to put it as in this sort of hierarchy of values or issues that you might be concerned about. It becomes a sort of defining way to look at everything. And that's frankly where I think a lot of our politics are today. And I want to provide what I think is a really good historical example of doing something different, which is acknowledging racial issues and racial inequality while also trying to build an expansive movement to improve the lives of people you care about. And this is an example I'm actually going to draw from Black American history, which is from Memphis, right? So this is actually a picture from Memphis in 1968. This is sort of at the height of the civil rights movement. So the first round of legislation to allow for equality in voting and desegregation, has happened. The Brown versus Board of Education school judicial opinion that allowed for school desegregation being enforced from the federal level has happened. So a lot of the big sort of political milestones have been accomplished by this point. But what's happening here is the sort of, well, what do you do with that now, right? Because there's all this frustration happening from all angles, where people are unhappy with their lives. Politics has said there's a change, but people aren't feeling a change. And so there's a tension sort of bubbling up in Memphis at this point. Well, this actually is actually the exact same time that Martin Luther King goes to Memphis in recognition of what's happening here. And he winds up being killed in Memphis in the same year, right? So this was the last political issue that he had committed himself to prior to being killed. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, because the importance of this, not just historically, but also in the eyes of a man who is one of the architects of how, of whatever limited progress we have made, right, in the world, I think a lot of it can be credited to him and his efforts. So, in this part of the world. So he thought this was important, and I think that, part of honoring him is trying to understand why he thought this is important and why it might be worth talking about in 2019. And so in particular, what brought him there was a strike. A group of Memphis sanitation workers, who were black men, were striking for two primary reasons. One is that despite sort of political changes in American society, they were still not given equal union representation as sanitation workers in Memphis. And they were upset because what that meant is they were put in worse working conditions. Two men at this time actually were killed in an accident because they were using equipment that was faulty. One is named E. Cole, and the other one is Robert Walker. And after these two men, who were part of this sort of sub-union of black sanitation workers, were killed, these men decided that they were going to, there's a picture of the sort of machinery that wound up killing these two men, because it was not being tested and there were no union supports to make sure that they were working in safe working conditions. So these two men are killed, and black sanitation workers in Memphis are unhappy. But there's also another sort of looming political problem, which is that the local political leadership felt that, well, because the Civil Rights Act had been passed and now schools are, in theory, being desegregated, everyone should be just sort of satisfied with those changes. And these men were unhappy because they felt that was giving license to a sort of paternalism that they were unhappy about, right? Because this was this idea that, well, we've now done what you should be happy with, and you should accept our measurement for what progress looks like. And these men were unhappy. So this accident, this sort of political turmoil, winds up leading to this very famous strike. And I don't know if you've seen this image. Some of you who may have gone to some of the museums in Washington, D.C., this image is featured quite prominently. And I think of this as, this is one of my sort of favorite historical photos for a number of reasons. One, because you have these men, many of the people pictured in this image are the sanitation workers, and they stood up for themselves, right? And they said, look, I'm being treated unfairly, I want these changes, I'm not gonna accept the version of progress that you've given me, but I have a version of progress that I would like to see realized. But it's also the heart of their slogan, right? I mean, I am a man. And like to them, what that meant is, I am a person who deserves to be recognized as equal to others, right? That you are trying to define me as a member of this union, as a worker, as a citizen, as a member of a racial category, and using that to determine what I should expect of my life, right? What should I expect from my politicians? What should I desire for myself? And they're saying, no, that's not the thing that gets to determine who I am, right? Ultimately, I'm a man first, and I want to be recognized as such. It's also a very powerful challenge to paternalism, because there was this pervading idea that you could treat black men like they were children, right? That they are somehow need to be taken care of, and you need to feel sorry for them, and grant them pity, right? And they're saying, no, I'm a man. I'm a father, I have a family. I want to give for my family just like you do. And I want to be treated with that sort of respect. And that's why I love this image, because it is sort of symbolic of exactly what I'm talking about. These men were not blind to race. They felt race every day.
They were not blind to how race might produce inequalities in their society. They saw inequalities far greater than anything we might see in North America today. And yet, they still said, don't define me by that first, because the greater good they were trying to achieve was a greater good that was based on what they believed they were, right? And in their heart, they were men, and they believed that meant something. And they didn't want to subordinate that to the race politics around them. So here's a good contrast, right? Here's the juxtaposition. On one side, right, on your left, you have I am a man, which is a call to an expansive identity. It's a call to white people in America at that time to look at them and see themselves, right? To say, you're a man, you want things, well, I'm a man, I want those things too. That maybe we're actually very similar. And maybe what I want from my family is what you want too. And when I send my boy to school, I want him to be supported to learn how to read and write just as everyone else is, right? But on the right-hand side, you don't have that expansive invitation, right? Instead, what you have is, we are focused on the racial element of this problem. So you as a white person, you're seeing this problem not through how are we the same, you're seeing it through how are we different. And as a black person, I'm also learning how to express my political frustrations in a way that are more about, well, how am I explaining to you that how different we are, as opposed to explaining to you how similar we are. And that's why you should care, right? This is a really important shift, I think, in how the race conversation that, like, let's sort of underscore this, right? Both in 1968 and in 2019, these two images are considered progressive, right? And that's the reality, right? So me, if I'm criticizing Black Lives Matter, people assume, well, you must be a right-winger who doesn't want to talk about race, and you're angry about, you know, acknowledging history and racial inequality and all that. Okay. To me, my politics are actually quite rooted in a historical legacy of trying to overcome racial inequality. And there's not one right way to do that. I'm not saying that there's one approach, but I do think there's a difference in what role does race play in the solutions you're proposing. Because we might agree on the role race plays in the problems, right? We might agree that there's such a thing as bias and unequal distribution of resources and residential segregation. I agree all that. I've acknowledged all of that in my presentation. The difference, though, is that today, to be a progressive, apparently, is to say that in response to that is basically just more race. And I just don't think that that's correct, right? And I'm not sure that the men on the left in this picture believe that either, or at least some of them. So that's sort of the contrast I'm trying to get to, and I hope what you hear in my words is a call to be literate in the conversation of race, understand how it affects our society, understand how the history of race affects the inequalities that boys and men are experiencing in 2019. You need to get it, right? Because that's part of understanding reality. You can live in theory and you can pretend that race doesn't matter, or you can understand reality and say, well, depending on what you look like or where your parents come from, there's a difference in how many people you know who went to jail. And there's a difference in how many people you know didn't finish high school. That's reality. So we need to understand that. But we also need to have the comfort in what's right and a comfort in a better vision to be able to resist efforts to make race a continuing dominant idea in how we see ourselves. So this is sort of what I'm hoping to underscore as a shared vision for young men, right? Which is, if we were going to take a poll of people and ask, you know, what is it that you hope for your boy when you send him to school every day, or when he walks home from school or walks home from the bus stop? I think most parents, right, most fathers would have a similar view of what they hope for their son. And I really think we should spend a lot of time understanding that vision, because I think we should recognize that there's not a groundswell of interest in talking about a lot of the issues boys and men face. There's a lot of resistance to it, quite honestly. And when you take the lens of talking about masculinity, or boys, or men, or gender in the ways that I do, and in the ways that I think many people in this room do, you don't get like a ton of people running to your side saying, yeah, that's the issue we want to be passionate about, right? So if we recognize that there's an immediate hurdle in trying to have conversations about boys and young men prioritized, right? To take it seriously, to be embraced by people who control resources in our society, who tell the dominant narratives in the media and at universities, right? If we recognize that, then I think maybe the right thing to say is, well, how we overcome that is probably trying to work together as much as possible. And where there are things that divide us, we should be pretty critical and skeptical about those things. And where there are reasons to work together and articulate some sort of greater vision for boys and young men in our society, we should cling to that. We should embrace that. We should run in that direction. Because I think that's how we're going to build the groundswell of support that the boys and young men who struggle in our society need. And I think that's sort of where I'll pause for now. And thank you for listening. And I know that there is a Q&A period where I'm happy to answer any questions or hear from you. But I'm always grateful for an audience, so thank you very much.
For maybe just one or two questions. You'll be around for a little bit longer?
Yeah, I will be.
Okay. If there are additional questions, you can find Jamil outside. So let's take these two questions. Yes.
So Jamil, I understand from your presentation that you favor a more Martin Luther King type of philosophy as opposed to identity politics.
Yes.
Okay. From your presentation, the pie chart, I believe you said that in terms of the population of students who are being suspended, 1/3 Black male students from 1% of the population. Your views, I think, would be considered to be a little unfashionable on the left currently. And I would think a person who does hold a fashionable opinion would say, how do we go from 1% of the population to 1/3 of suspensions for young Black men without race being the significant factor? Perhaps also as an issue about how men are enculturated in our society currently, that's also an issue. But in terms of the place of race, I believe that, for your ideological opponents, that would be one of the issues that they would attack you on. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not 1%, it's 1 out of 10, so 10%. Yeah, but it's still 3 times disproportionality, right? So yeah, it's a great point, and that's why I bring it up, because I'm trying to not run from the data that's difficult to wrestle with, right? And it's important to me. I spend a lot of my time in majority Black schools. I see the various sort of structural issues that exist in the life of an average Black student in this city. So here's what I mean in terms of that. These are very complex issues, and the way that data is currently being interpreted by the Toronto District School Board, which has a lot of people who would identify as politically left running it, right, is that it is a matter of racial bias among teachers and administrators. So the reason why you have that disproportionality is because white people are racist, or there's systemic racism, or there's some sort of unidentifiable but present racial force that exists within these schools. My argument to that would be, I'm sure bias may very well be a relevant variable, and trying to understand that is important. And there's actually work you can do as an institution to understand the various inflection points where an individual's bias might determine his or her decision making, right? I've seen that in the child welfare system, for example. But that's one of a multitude of effects. And it's one that we have to be very careful as people who are passionate about the issue to not let what might be convenient for some people lead us in one direction. So you ask yourself, well, why is racial bias the focus of people running the schools? Perhaps one might say it could be because the broader issue of the fact that Black children are disproportionately living in poverty is a difficult reality for people to face. Because what it means is that the politicians who fund the school board might have to look in the mirror and ask, well, people who share my political views have been in power in Ontario for the last 20 years up until the most recent election. Why, if our ideas are so great, did that poverty rate among Black families not change? And that's a much harder question for people to face. And it gets to, I think, a bigger sort of question about, how should we be building urban neighborhoods, and what sort of policy should we be enacting? And that is, I think, a complex question that people don't want to ask. So my response is like, Do I think racial bias may be relevant? Absolutely. Do I think that that is the only factor? Absolutely not. All the data shows that poverty is a predictor of these things as much as race is, that parental involvement matters. When you spend time at the schools, you see the level of engagement that the administrators have. You also see patterns in how teachers' unions operate, which is like a big issue that nobody likes to talk about in Ontario. So you add all these things together and you say, well, it's quite convenient then to define this in a very simple way because it makes for a political narrative that's easy to sell to people. But when you want to solve the problem, the easy narrative isn't actually going to lead you to the solution. And that's how I respond to people who raise that point, is I think that culture matters, economics matter, politics matter, all of that sort of stuff is important to try to make the world a better place. And when people are ideologically bound to one of those things to the detriment of the other, I think that's a mistake.
We have time for one more quick question. I'm sorry, I was going to go to this gentleman.
First, excellent presentation. You used the term that you didn't have a community growing up. You said it several times.
Yeah.
You work with young people. Community is incredibly important. How does one create community for young men in these situations?
Yeah, there's a lot of dimensions to it. So one is simply like the provision of sort of services and activities that I think young people need exposure to. There are things that you can do in terms of like having sort of a presence physically in people's neighborhoods, but also presence in schools matters a lot, I think, to having access to young people. And there are ways that school boards can make that easier, or they can make that more difficult. But I think that generally having an open doors mentality where you're trying to give more and more people with different approaches to engaging youth, access to youth, helps the probability of reaching a greater number of people. And where you don't have the resources to offer those services, where people aren't, there's not a philanthropic effort to bring it to people, or there's not a policy effort to bring it to people, that's a problem. So the landscape in which services are made available is important. The other element of it too is just sort of involvement in people's lives. Like when you think about yourself as a citizen, there's also ways of thinking about yourself as a mentor and your responsibility to other people and to people younger than you and how you can sort of connect to them. I think that the deterioration of faith communities in this country, in the United States and Western Europe, is a massive issue. And I think that where you see very strong faith networks, you typically see better outcomes for people who are engaged in them. And that's another thing that I do a lot of work, especially in very difficult circumstances. I think that people who bring a faith element to the work add a lot of value, and that's something that's sort of in broad decline across the West right now, and that's an issue. And I guess lastly I would say is I do think that there is a shift happening in the expectations that men have of themselves, I hope, in recognizing that as our economy changes, as women participate more in the labor force, there need to be ways that we think of giving back to our families that are just different from, deposit a check and then sort of leave. I think people in cafe really understand that, right? Which is why there's a lot of passion around around father involvement and making sure that when families break apart, that fathers are able to still be involved in meaningful ways. And that's an important part of the community aspect too, because you can never have a problem where a kid has too many adults who care about him or her, right? And the idea that you make it harder for a caring father to participate in his child's life, unless there's a good reason, but just on face value, that's a massive misstep.
Thank you. Good job. So this is why I said perfect speaker to open today's conference. Wonderful presentation. Thanks for getting us started with the bang, Jamil. Let me just say, I don't mean this specifically to this presentation, but to the entire 2 days. You will hear some things that will challenge you. As Robert mentioned earlier, the ideological spectrum is being well represented over the next couple of days. And so that's okay. I mean, one thing that Cafe, I think, does well, and I wish more organizations sort of follow our lead, is creating a space for difficult conversations on some very sensitive topics, but doing it with respect, but not shying away from the disagreement and the debate. So we like to do that and look forward to some fireworks, hopefully positive ones over the next couple of days.